one of the things that really got me interested in the particular way we approach material culture that I have tended to advocate over the years was actually an observation around consumption. And it was simply that when I looked around me, I could see that all the academics I knew, social scientists, etc., seemed to be avidly into modern mass consumption. A lot of conversation was about, fashion and about the right restaurants and the holidays, etc., etc. Generally, people felt their wages, even though at a global scale are relatively decent, were actually insufficient for many of these purposes, and so forth. And yet, if you actually ask them the question about their opinion on consumption, they would, to a person, have responded about, in terms of these kind of ethical issues, about it being also kind of antisocial, not just non-sustainable, but in a sense bad for you in all sorts of ways. And there seemed to be this extraordinary divergence between what you would have extrapolated from the observation of practice and what you would have thought on the basis of talking to people. So a lot of my work has been in anthropology which said, don't talk to people, don't interview, don't focus group, don't just try and observe what they actually do, and then try and understand what actually are these kind of values that are going on, or at least understand that discrepancy. The second point, I guess, coming into consumption, was the ethics of me was in a sense, very straightforward when I first started. Because I did my PhD in an Indian village, all my water was from the well, the field was my toilet, and after the time that I felt it was in many ways a very deeply unhappy place, an awful lot of suffering, and my concern was poverty. And it remains poverty. And therefore, I have always assumed that I would want everybody else to enjoy similar levels of consumption to myself. And if I was to look at the academics in practice, as it were, it seemed to me that an income of about, 50,000 a year was what people were generally kind of striving for as comfortable. So my wish would be that the 400 million in China who are still at this very low level should ultimately not only be able to afford meat, but actually to gain an income level commensurate with my own. Any other attitude to me would seem hypocritical, and therefore, inasmuch as that represents a vast increase in consumption compared to what we have today, I guess I have to be seen as a consumerist, as somebody, in a sense, who in part represents that stance which we've been describing as kind of evil. Furthermore, I am somebody who was always opposed to looking at these in terms of modernist ideas of things like need as opposed to waste, as opposed to etc. Because I'm an anthropologist. We don't look at Trobriand Islanders growing yams, etc., in terms of need and waste, etc. We always see material culture as essentially culturally expressive. What is it that people are trying to, as it were, do with this material? Not merely do they have it or do they not have it. And indeed, even in an Indian village where I worked, the main cause of debt were things like wedding expenditures and funeral expenditures. And this, in a sense, dominated all the consumption I've ever seen. So a lot of my work has tried to concentrate not necessarily first on, if you like, the ethics of consumption, but consumption as a place that is expressive in a way that you could therefore learn about people's ethics because they were being manifested through those consumption practices. So one of my first books about consumption was the study of Trinidad. Very briefly, what I argued was that I could see that the morality in Trinidad was really divided between two aims, partly coming from the history of slavery, etc. One was to do the creation of kind of roots, long-term consumption, sort of consolidation, associated with Christmas. The other one was associated with consumption associated with carnival, a much more transient, keeping a notion of freedom, etc., etc. And there was a long tussle between these two values. And one of the things that I felt going there in an oil boom situation where consumption was rapidly increasing was simply that previously a lot of this tussle of values was actually expressed through a different set of things, that is, people. So if you looked at the way people thought and talked about gender, or about ethnicity, or about class, they used these differences. Women represent this, men represent that, ex-African represents this, ex-Indian represent that. And what I found fascinating was the way a lot of that was moving to being expressed much more in terms of objects that are not people, things. So one of the slightly bizarre conclusions I came to was that the rise of modern mass consumption potentially lessened the incidence of what you might call kind of racism, gender stereotypes, etc., etc. Not a particularly popular conclusion, but I simply follow the evidence that I find. So, on one hand, I'm interested in seeing what consumption is used for, and a lot of that, therefore, seeing as positive, recognizing that people wish to demonstrably improve their standard of livings, and being in opposition to poverty. At the same time, I was actually quite an early adopter of issues to do with climate change. I remember getting hold of the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth, feeling passionate about it from the very beginning. In those days, when you argued for these things, you were just seen as a kind of freak. But I have always believed in those arguments, seen them as absolutely central, regard climate change as absolutely and sustainability as the single biggest issues facing humanity, and would not wish to detract from the central arguments of the previous paper, which then leads me to a problem. How do I both be evil and good, as it were, at the same time? Well, one of the ways I would argue is to actually then see some of the problems with the way these ethical ideas are expressed when understood as manifested through consumption, and how that then relates to the wider sphere of ethics. So if we take ethics first, where does the ethics come from? In the book I did in 2005, Materiality, my starting point is that the most important foundational point of most of the ethical values that we hold tend to come from the world religions, and the world religions have mostly been fundamentally anti-material. The most obvious would be the likes of Hinduism and Buddhism, etc., in which it is precisely the repudiation of one's association with things that allows you to reach enlightenment, etc. But equally, think Christianity, rich eye of the needle, etc., etc. We are all brought up with a sense of basic ethics that has come from millennia of, in a sense, religious teaching, which opposes the ideals that are associated with the rise of a greater number of things, or indeed being associated with material objects themselves. And in some ways, I think as things have become more secular, the decline of formal religion, they then get transformed into other kinds of analogous negatives. So the more common expression today would be what you might call the accusation of materialism, which implies, in effect, that people who are too orientated to things have this orientation at the expense of their orientation to people. The more you devote yourself to things, the less you are devoted to people. And I would argue, through a number of different projects that I've done in the past, that this is conspicuously not the case. That actually, for the Comfort of Things and kind of other books, that people, for one reason or another, are generally enabled to develop deep and sustained relationships, and then usually it is with things, with people, maybe with pets, or for various reasons, for other things that have gone on in their lives, they have difficulty developing those deep and sustained relations. And it tends to be then across the board. So I've never accepted this kind of argument about materialism, although, of course, I can't overgeneralize. There must be examples that would illustrate precisely that problem. So there is that issue of trying to worry through the implications of an ethics that is actually coming from elsewhere, and that then, in a sense, gets conflated with the ethical issues we associate with sustainability, with issues of green, etc. You've got two different sources, but they tend to just come together as one, which is essentially an opposition to the world of things and the world of consumption. And in a sense, it gets kind of more problematic because as somebody who looks at the way consumption is used as expressive, you start to see that these become expressive of other forces that are there in society. So it becomes evident that the people who advocate green ideologies or ideals that are anti-consumerist also become associated with higher levels of class, of education, of elites. And there is very good work, like the PhD by Cynthia Eisenhower on Swedish green movements, Aldhan on the problems of getting effective environmental messages across in Norway, etc., which certainly reinforce the idea that we live in a world, if we would redo Bourdieu and consumption, we would see that one of the key characteristics that differentiates people by consumption is an advocacy of green ethical consumption, which tends to put you at the top of the scale, and the way that increasingly looks down upon the consumption of what are then seen as, if you like, irresponsible people who are not behaving in a kind of ethical, appropriate, responsible way. A sort of, fat shaming, but with respect to everything else that is going on in society. And that was important because it helped explain something else that I had been observing when I've been working, for example, the year that I spent shopping with people. Because I could see that there was this kind of issue around how ethical people are actually being seen by others and being portrayed by others. It's in, for example, general popular culture. At the time, I think I was listening to the Archers, and I saw, there were figures like, I think it was Linda Snell, a person who stands for ethics, right? Who stands for, we should be doing fair trade, we should be doing green consumption, we should be concerned about all these various issues. And yet, seem to be portrayed as relatively cold, relatively distant, as against the kind of people whose practices we would regard as anything but ethical. I think it was the Grundys then, who were cheating and getting their way in all sorts of ways and weren't really concerned with the wider world, who seem to be the lovable kind of warm characters. So, why are good people who have wide ethical concerns seen as less favoured than the people who are at the other end, who don't seem to be attracted by those ideologies? And that went with the wider issues that were coming up in the work on shopping, and basically one of the answers to this was there was an argument between what in those days I was calling morality and ethics. That is to say, the morality was people essentially were expected to use consumption to be concerned with the welfare of their families. So they would want to save money, be thrifty. I went out today and I managed to find 6 savings, and when I bought all this stuff, and I'm helping the family. That's my responsibility. Whereas, at least in those days, if you cared about the wider world and the wider issues, it often cost more. Green goods were often more expensive than ordinary goods, or more, artisanal, etc., which most people couldn't afford. And therefore, you start to get this antagonism between ethics and morality, and that leads to a wider problem of the way these kind of issues are represented. Now, all of that was flowing through from studies around ordinary consumption. More recently, I turned from those studies, in the last 5 years, I've been working on the area of, several people mentioned, social media and digital fields. And one of the things that was interesting was that in many ways, I think I've reprised exactly the same set of arguments and processes dealing with the digital world as I was dealing with the material world. So the starting point seems to be a down-the-line ethical repudiation of social media. that every day in the papers you will read that really social media is antisocial, it's a fixation on your screen, it's probably doing in your cognitive abilities, etc. So I mean, think selfies, it's selfish, it's individualistic, it's anti-community, etc. A constant condemnation of the whole orientation to social media. In ordinary discourse, we say this all the time, and also, as it were, in the press. And my job was to try and actually find out what social media actually is in practice, just as in the same way I was studying shopping and consumption by sitting with people every day as they go shopping and trying to understand what is going on here. So 9 of us spent 16 months each in different countries around the world, sitting in communities, just trying to watch what actually happened with ordinary, mundane social media. And the first issue, I suppose, was to say, actually, this is a field of consumption. Because the problem is that, and again, in the media representation, social media is simply what the corporations produce. It's the Facebook company, etc., etc. Whereas our argument has always been that actually in each place we worked, even though we're always using Facebook, you had a totally different social media. Social media was actually mainly content. It's what people themselves creatively do as consumers. And furthermore, one of the reasons you couldn't, I mean, much as the corporations make vast amounts of money out of this and would like to control everything, one of the things we observed is that the basis of these content were essentially genres of communication, social communication. That's what social media is. And they migrate happily between different platforms. So you take something like playground banter. It goes from that originally to one of the earliest social medias, which was BBM associated with BlackBerry phones because they were cheap. Then in some countries it migrates to Facebook. In England, amongst young people at school, it's migrated to Twitter. And they're completely different platforms. This shouldn't happen. So it's the content, it's the work of the consumers that actually make social media, which is why our main book on the topic is not called How Did Social Media Change the World? It's called How Did the World Change Social Media? And furthermore, it doesn't have any simple or directional ethical consequence. Actually, on any area that we have investigated, social media has, as you would expect, because it's simply part of ordinary consumption, opposite moral implications. It's great for education. You can look things up so easily, find information, spread information. It's terrible for education. It's a real distraction, etc., etc. It's a vehicle for striving against political repression. It's one of the best vehicles for political repression, etc., etc. It is essentially has to be understood as part of this wider world of, if you like, expressive consumption in which we argue through anything that is going on. And as in previous material consumption, it is also an area through which we construct ethics. So let me just give one example. There is a phenomena that didn't really exist before social media, and therefore it's particularly interesting if you're studying the subject. This thing called memes, right? You know what a meme is, right? Little kind of picture with a few words in it. And it's huge in social media. It proliferates all over the place. But what the hell are all these memes about? What are they doing there? And actually, if you look at them, you find there's two main forms. There are ones that tend to be advocating certain strong moral positions. Pentecostal Christians use a lot of memes. We were working with Hindu memes that were used as blessings early in the morning, etc., etc. Here, they tend to be mainly funny, but funny in a way that usually puts down politicians, puts down males, puts down all sorts of issues that are discussed in a sense through these. And what we found again was that a lot of people around the world who don't feel terribly confident expressing their ethical values, and not necessarily very literate, like to share these because it's a way of demonstrating your affinity with one set of moral values as opposed to another, but without having to come out and be very articulate yourself as in terms of defending your particular, as it were, ethical position. And so memes actually are, again, consumption, if you like, used to discuss and create ethical worlds, but not necessarily, as it were, seen in that way. Now, the problem then is that I deal in a world in which, as an anthropologist, I cannot but respect ordinary practice. If ordinary consumers are doing it, I have to assume they know what they're doing largely, they are creative in the ways they use these things, they are having important ethical debates themselves through the use of this capacity that they have in the proliferation both of material things and now increasingly non-material things. And yet, at the same time, we have the problems that were discussed in the previous paper. And the main reason, there are two reasons I'm not discussing them myself. One is that the previous speaker really knows about these things, and I really don't. And secondly, because I was pretty sure I was going to agree with everything that was said, which I did, about what we actually do need to do in terms of our problems with this. But what I think my work has pointed out is possibly some ways in which we may want to slightly rethink how those ideals about sustainability, climate change, etc., are actually put out into the world in order to make them more attractive to a wider body of people. And I agree that I have no experience, unlike the last speaker, in actually attempting to do so. But I'm just following what would be the logic that follows from everything I've said up to now. What then should you do? And the first problem is that we need to differentiate these two ethical strands. The strand that is effectively the deep, if you like, ex-religious strand that basically is anti-material in and of itself. You are good because you are opposed to things. Because otherwise, the message that you should oppose things because we absolutely have to in order to deal with climate change and sustainability becomes conflated with this much wider morality, which people have often experienced in some ways as oppressive. And as I've also suggested, tends to get associated with a top-down kind of elitist expression of what morality should be, and all you people down there aren't doing it, right? You're the irresponsible ones. We are teaching you how to be. And therefore, it would seem to me that maybe it would be a good thing if some people in the green movement were exuberantly in favour of certain kinds of conspicuous consumption and waste, etc., in certain areas, like the use of digital technologies, if you like, or if you want to have 16 different dresses for your wardrobe, etc., precisely in order to demonstrate that on the one hand, there are things we have to do because the science says we have to do it, but it is not just me as a moralist telling you you are bad. Okay? As long as those are conflated, I think people will be suspicious that this is actually science talking to them. They will think it's what, as it were, the priest has always said to them. So the first thing that follows from what I've argued is for the differentiation between two forms of morality that I think have become conflated in these arguments. The second conclusion is pretty much the identical conclusion I realised in some ways from the last paper, which is, and this is a talk about in this book, Consumption, Its Consequences, which is that I can't see that something as important as saving the planet ought to be based upon consumer choice. I mean, that seems to be pandering to the economists, which I have no more desire to do than the last speaker. It shouldn't be, if people, okay, what if they decide they don't want to save the planet? We get the situation we're in today, exactly that situation. So in a way, consumption is the wrong vehicle for trying to tackle the problem. That's where people use expressively to deal with their kind of ethical issues, etc., etc. Surely, the place where the emphasis should be, and I know the last speaker spends much of his time doing this, is precisely on the politics of regulation, the politics of production, the politics of banning stuff. If it isn't something we should have, we shouldn't have the opportunity to have it in the first place. And that then deals with another of the issues. Because if I've argued that we are in a serious dilemma because of the way ethics and consumption has been mapped onto class and inequality, then it's even more important, surely, that the regulations that are promulgated by governments should not be themselves open to inequality. In other words, if the chemical isn't there, nobody can have it. So I don't particularly support things like being able to sell quotas or having your cars on alternate days if rich people can have 2 cars, etc. It seems to me that you have to have conspicuous equality because you're dealing with an area where people are very, very suspicious that this is actually another movement in inequality, that green claims to be anti-conspicuous consumption, but it is the most conspicuous consumption in the modern world. You do green and show everybody. You're setting them a good example, but actually it is extremely conspicuous consumption that, not surprisingly, other people see as valorizing conspicuous consumption. There are deep contradictions in the way this has evolved over time. Not anybody's to blame, but it's just things, once they're out in the world, get mapped onto these cultural differences. And then my argument would be that has to be taken into account in terms of how the message will, in fact, in turn, be consumed. And I am probably going to leave it there. Yeah. To have time for education. I have time for. I had some things to say about. Okay, I'll say one more thing, which relates to. Which relates actually because I was talking to Ian Cook earlier. I mean, one thing that people will know from my earlier work is I also have always advocated the centrality of these issues at the level of basic education. And I will say, because it's become important to my more recent work, that I think this is another area where academics can really suffer from this kind of hypocrisy. That we claim we want people to learn from this kind of work, but we put ourselves out there in a way that again structures bourgeois elites. The whole point is people can't understand what we're saying, and that puts them down. We intimidate people all the time. And it has been very important, therefore, in the recent project we've done on social media, that we increasingly produce stuff that is judged by accessibility. It has to be extremely readable. You will know I am a passionate advocate for open access. I do not think academic work should be paid for at all. And it should be approachable. I mean, one of the nice things I feel about the social media stuff is we have 250,000 book downloads. And in places like Ethiopia, in the Philippines, round the world, in a way we would never have done if we had not ourselves questioned the impact of the way we produce and how people consume. It's why most of my stuff is now done in videos of under 5 minutes, because we look at how people consume and we have to align what we do to the way people consume. So in a sense, I would just bring that back to the beginning. What you can see is I've tried to argue that constantly I'm looking at what we do and comparing it with what we say and judging on the basis of the discrepancy between those two things. And for me, the key to getting this right is often trying to tackle that fundamental discrepancy. Then I really will stop.